Hi, I'm Anne Fitton Glenn. I am a longtime journalist who's lived in Asheville since 1997. During my decades here, I have written about the people, the small businesses, the entertainment, the foodways, the beverages, and the history of Western North Carolina. I'd first of all like to thank Kelly Shen for inviting me to participate in North Carolina 10 for 10, and also thank all the amazing North Carolina writers that I've had the pleasure of listening to since this project started. The nonprofit that I would like to support today is Mountain True, which is an Asheville-based environmental organization that's working to clean up our rivers and mountains and forests after Hurricane Helene, which is still an ongoing and monumental task. I was here in my Asheville home during the hurricane and for most of the aftermath. I live just above the French Broad River and the River Arts District. My personal story is like a lot of people's, lots of downed trees on my property, some impinged on things we would prefer them have not to. No power for several days, no ability to communicate for several days, no running water for almost 2 months. So it was intense, but not devastating. But I do know people whose lives were devastated. I know people who died in the floodwaters. I know people who lost family members and friends and homes and businesses. So in addition to donations to area nonprofits, as we come up on almost a year since Hurricane Helene, you can really show support by visiting Western North Carolina. Most places have reopened. Asheville is definitely reopened. So come visit, and while you're here, maybe drink a local beer. Why beer? Well, that brings me to my reading. I'm going to read from a slightly rewritten section, because I can't quite help myself, from a chapter in my first beer history book, which was titled Asheville Beer. I have a second volume called Western North Carolina Beer, but I know a lot of writers are following this 10 for 10, and so when I'm reading to other writers, I like to read from a chapter that's called Writers, Artists, and Beer Drinkers. And this is about F. Scott Fitzgerald's time in Asheville. It's kind of a sad story, but here we are. It's an important one. The inspirational natural beauty and relaxing atmosphere of the Paris of the South have long attracted creative types to the area. Many writers, artists, and musicians have visited the region, and a goodly number of them stayed on, especially after Asheville started to revitalize in the 1980s and 90s. So what does this have to do with beer? Asheville's most famous native son, writer Thomas Wolfe, penned some scintillating prose about beer and about his so-called fictional experience with an alcoholic father. Plus, one of the most famous tourists to ever visit, F. Scott Fitzgerald, spent most of his time in Asheville drinking massive amounts of beer. Then there's the city's River Arts District, home to the studios of hundreds of artists and a handful of homegrown breweries. Affectionately known as the Rad, this part of town includes Depot Street, where Asheville's main train station once stood. The 19th century warehouses that stored beer deliveries now house artist studios. Or they did before Helene, when most of the Rad was immersed under the waters of the French Broad River. But on to Fitzgerald. The most well-known writer to consume vast quantities of beer within Asheville city limits was F. Scott Fitzgerald. You can fight me on that. He lived in two rooms, 441 and 443 at the Grove Park Inn in North Asheville during the summer of 1935, and then again for several months in 1936. One room was for sleeping and the other was for writing. During his first summer here, his wife Zelda was being treated for mental illness in a sanitarium in Baltimore, although the next summer Fitzgerald installed her in Asheville's Highland Hospital. Ostensibly, the famous writer was in town to escape mounting debt and the pressures of chasing critical and commercial success. However, it seems that he was mostly in Asheville to consume lots of beer and to watch the comings and goings of female guests from his windows above the entryway to the Grove Park. Not long after arriving in town, Fitzgerald, searching for a bathroom and supposedly awash with beer, stumbled into a small bookstore located in downtown Asheville's Grove Arcade. He there formed a friendship of sorts with the bookstore owner, Tony Batita. On meeting Batita, Fitzy admitted he was inebriated, despite also being on the wagon. Known as the beer cure, some people at the time believed that drinking beer while abstaining from hard liquor could potentially cure alcoholism. So for Fitzgerald, being on the wagon meant that he allowed himself beer, and beer aplenty. Batita would eventually pen a memoir with the lengthy title, After the Good Gay Times, Asheville, Summer of '35, A Season with F. Scott Fitzgerald. From Batita's account, it doesn't sound like his season with Fitzgerald was much fun. In fact, the writer's mercurial moods and heavy drinking dominated the friendship. Using the discarded bottles in Fitzgerald's hotel room for reference, Batita estimated that the writer was consuming up to 30 beers per day that summer of '35. The next year of his Asheville residency, Fitzgerald hired a local secretary named Marie Shank. She later wrote, "I haven't ever before or since seen such quantities of beer displayed in such a place. Each trash basket was full of empties, so was the tub in one of the baths. Stacks of cases served as tables for manuscripts, books, and supplies of paper." What kind of beer he was imbibing is anyone's guess, although it can be assumed that the beer wasn't particularly strong, as in post-Prohibition North Carolina at the time, only beer up to 4% alcohol by volume was legal. There were no breweries at the time in Asheville, at least no legal breweries, so most beer would have been shipped here, usually by rail, from nearby states that had breweries, such as Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. Despite being on the wagon, Fitzgerald wasn't always keen to stick to malt beverages, especially after an accident where, showing off for a group of local ladies, he dove off a diving board into Beaver Lake, and injured his shoulder. Let's say that again. He dove off a diving board into Beaver Lake and injured his shoulder. So, he often sent Grove Park employees out to procure him illicit bottles of gin and Carolina moonshine. Toward the end of his first summer in Asheville, his drinking became so disruptive that the hotel's manager instructed his employees to ignore the author's request for anything stronger than beer, or they would be fired. When Fitzgerald protested, citing the supposed medicinal qualities of gin for his ailing health, the manager held his ground, demanding a prescription from Fitzgerald's doctor before he lifted the booze embargo. When this didn't happen, the author checked out of the Grove Park. He then, with Batita accompanying him, decided to inquire about a room at the boarding house owned and run by Thomas Wolfe's mother, Julia. Fitzgerald knew Wolfe personally, telling Batita, "Tom and I had a drinking bout in Switzerland when I was there watching over Zelda. Tom expected unqualified admiration for everything, something I couldn't even give to Ernest." Hemingway, that is. After giving the men a brief tour, Julia Wolfe, a notorious teetotaler who had been married to an alcoholic, realized Fitzgerald was drunk, denied him a room, and slammed the door in his face. Fitzgerald then left Asheville only to return several months later. He charmed his way back into the Grove Park and then remained on his beer-only wagon, at least as far as the hotel manager knew. Despite having been denied a room by Julia Wolfe, Fitzgerald did show up one day at Asheville's old Sonley Library to scold the librarians for mistreating Thomas Wolfe and ignoring the importance of Look Homeward, Angel. That novel was banned in Asheville for 7 years after its 1929 publication, mostly because the city's residents who were fictionalized in its pages were none too happy about their portrayals there. Fitzgerald struggled to write for most of his time in Asheville. Petita's memoir paints a fairly sympathetic portrait of a tortured artist who produced more in the way of extramarital affairs and empty beer cans than prose. He did do some work on his never-to-be-completed final novel, The Last Tycoon, while at the Grove Park. However, Fitzgerald's affinity for Asheville and the Blue Ridge Mountains was strong. After leaving Asheville, he spent several months in Tryon, North Carolina, living at Oak Hall, before setting out for Hollywood to try to make a dent in his ever-growing debt. Unknown to Fitzgerald, who died of a heart attack in 1940, his decision to put Zelda in Asheville's Highland Hospital was an ill-fated one. Though she left the hospital for several periods, she did die there in a fire while locked in her room in 1948. 8 other women died as well. Despite this rather melancholy tale, the Grove Park makes much of its connection to F. Scott, and even collaborated with Asheville's oldest brewery, Highland Brewery, to make a Great Gatsby Abbey Ale back in 2010. Locally brewed beer does seem a fitting tribute to Fitzgerald, particularly given this tale of his beery times in Asheville. Thank you very much.